Wow, you have made it to part 3 of Writing an Orator's Speech. Congratulations, you may tap yourself on the shoulder. Because you have now gone through part 1 and part 2, you now have a lot of information that needs to be adapted, that needs to be altered, that needs to be changed into the body of a persuasive speech. In other words, it could be that you've got 3 or 4 or maybe 5 pages of information, and this now needs to be structured into a 3 arguments speech. And obviously each of those 3 arguments will have each of the sources. Now, how will you decide which arguments you are going to use? And the answer is quite simple. Read it out loud. Because remember that you are writing for a listener and not for a reader. In other words, when you are reading your information out loud, it is going to give you a better idea of which of the arguments that you already have you should be choosing. Because you are going to, out of all of the information you have, you are going to select the best 3. Through all these pages and pages of information, you are going to identify the best 3 arguments. How are you going to do this? By reading out the information. Why would that be important? Because remember, we are writing a speech for the listener and not for a reader. And while you are going through identifying the top 3 arguments, you also need to ask yourself the question, in which order, chronological order, am I going to present this to my audience? And in the process of identifying the top 3 arguments, as well as the order in which you're going to present this, you also need to make 100% sure that each of those sources you have at each of those arguments do support your argument. And then, after you've made a decision regarding the 3 arguments and the order of these 3 arguments, please determine the length of time, the duration of the body of the speech. Now that you have the top 3 arguments, and you've also decided upon the order in which you're going to present these 3 arguments, you now need to have a look at the total or the complete structure of a speech. You would start with an introduction, which I believe goes without saying. You would have your first, second and third argument, as well as your closing paragraph. In the context of orators, a closing paragraph will always have a summary and a closing sentence. Now remember, the aim or the purpose of the introduction is twofold. Number 1, it is to attract in an appropriate way the attention of your audience. And secondly, it is to introduce your topic to the audience without announcing your topic. The topic will be introduced to your audience. You would then move from the introduction to the first argument. After you've given your first argument, you will have a moment of silence, then moving on to the second. After the second, you'll have a moment of silence just to give your audience time to absorb what you've said. Third argument, and then move on to the closing paragraph. The closing paragraph, as I have said, has got a very short summary of what was said and a powerful closing sentence. You might want to consider ways in which to give flow to your speech. These are not ideas simply to give flow to the speech, but also to give your audience structure to your speech. In other words, when you say something like, in the first place, secondly, lastly, then that is a very clear indication to your audience that you have addressed your first argument, you move on to the next, and lastly. But please note, it is maybe slightly better if you do it in a creative way. For example, the first time I looked in the mirror, I saw. The next time I saw myself in the mirror, I was horrified at. My last look in the mirror made me discover. Right, so those are ways in which you can, in a creative way, give flow to your speech, as well as give structure to your speech. Very often people want to know when they are supposed to address the chairperson. Now, whether you begin with your speech with the word chairperson or not is up to you. However, you must address the chairperson during your introduction. Please note the type of introduction. In other words, the way in which you start your first few words or your first few sentences could impact your decision as to whether you're going to start your speech with the word chairperson or whether you're going to say the word chairperson a little bit later in your introduction. Let me give an example. If you are going to start with a beautiful prayer, or you're going to start with a few lines from a poem, then I think it makes sense to first share those few lines from the poem before you say the word chairperson. Whereas, if you're going to ask a question, then it does make sense to start with the word chairperson. For example, chairperson, have you also felt that you can be your own worst enemy when you're facing yourself in a mirror? So depending on the way in which you're going to introduce your speech to the audience could impact your decision as to whether you're going to start your speech with the word chairperson or whether you're going to say the word chairperson a little bit later in your introduction. You have made it to the end of part 3 of this video course called Writing an Orator's Speech. Thank you very much for your commitment. Thank you for your dedication. And thank you very much for giving of yourself to empower your child, not only to be able to write a good orator's speech, but also to develop those vitally important skills to become an incredible writer and speaker. Best of luck with this phenomenal creative journey.